I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Center for Latin American Studies. I'm Harley Shaken, the chair of the center, and we're very pleased you're all here tonight. As you know, this is the bicentennial of Mexican independence. It is the centennial of the Mexican Revolution. The Center for Latin American Studies will be having a year-long program commemorating both events. And we begin that program tonight with a lecture on the promise and the legacy of the Mexican Revolution. And I think there is no one more appropriate, more fitting to deliver this lecture tonight than the speaker I'm going to introduce in a moment. I'd just like to say a very short word about the format. We will have the opening lecture, and then we will have time for questions. Please write your questions short on an index card and pass it to the center aisles. These will be collected during the talk itself. We will ask as many as possible after the talk. But I would point out, we know we will not be able to answer or ask all of them, but our speaker tonight has agreed to answer further questions that are submitted on the website of the Center for Latin American Studies, where a video of the talk itself will appear. That's clas.berkeley.edu. The promise and the legacy of the Mexican Revolution is an extraordinary historical topic, but it is also a topic with direct meaning for Mexico and for the United States today and going forward towards tomorrow. I am very pleased that we have with us tonight and this semester teaching a course here at Berkeley, Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas. Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas truly needs no introduction, but I'm going to be very brief. He is someone who has traveled an extraordinary, unique political road in Mexico. It has been an uncharted path fraught with the most extraordinary difficulties. He has met these challenges with courage, conviction, a vision of development, a commitment to democracy, and a deep passion for human beings. He has brought all this together, and his efforts, his understanding, and his commitment have resulted in a more democratic Mexico and in profound transformations along this route, which I suspect will continue into the future. One brief personal note for myself, for many in the audience who have worked and met with Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas 3 years ago and on this visit to Berkeley. It is truly an exceptional pleasure and a deep honor to have him with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas.
I want to thank Harley Shaken for his presentation. I want to thank you all for being here tonight. It's an honor for me to be here in Berkeley once more. It's an honor to be here before all of you. I shall talk today of how the Mexican Revolution broke. I shall also talk of key decisions in the process of Mexico's revolutionary transformation, of some setbacks, and why, under Mexico's present circumstances, I consider ideals and unattained goals of the Mexican Revolution keep their validity and show today Mexicans the paths to follow in the building of a democratic and sovereign nation and in the development of an egalitarian and progressive society. The social and political movement known as the Mexican Revolution exploded as a reaction against a long-lasting dictatorship, an authoritarian regime centered in one man and in one man's decisions. It was a social reaction against a change-resistant system. Nothing seemed to move in Mexico. Apparently, everything remained immobile. People were tired, disenchanted, irritated, for there were no opportunities for those offered by the dictator. Porfirio Díaz decided life in Mexico. Porfirio Díaz, a hero in the war against the French intervention and Maximilian of Habsburg's empire, ran twice as presidential candidate and lost. He took arms against the outcomes of those elections, was militarily defeated, arrested, and amnestied. He persisted in rebellion, ousted the president, and was proclaimed president. His uprisings had been under the slogan of no re-election, no more re-election of the President of the Republic. He served his term 1876-1880. A close politician to him, a general who as himself had fought against intervention and the empire, his compadre, was elected or chosen by him to succeed him. When time arrived, arguments were found. He was the necessary one, the indispensable, and Díaz was elected for his second term, 1884-1888. The Constitution was reformed in 1887. The president could opt for re-election once, only once, and Díaz became candidate and was elected for the next term, 1888-1892. Another constitutional reform took place, and from then on, there was no limit for repeated re-elections. Díaz was candidate in 1896, in 1900, 1904, this time to serve a 6-year term. Then he made a big mistake. Díaz gave an interview to an American journalist, James Krillman, which was published at the same time in Mexico and in the United States in March 1908, in which Díaz declared Mexico was mature for democracy, democratic practices should revive, he would not be candidate in 1910, and he would see favorably the emergence of an opposition party. Nobody believed he would not run, but many thought there would be a democratic race for the vice presidency. By 1910, Díaz would be 80. The term would end in 1916. So in public mind, there was that whoever were to be Díaz vice president would succeed him within the term. The Krillman interview also provoked the emergence of an anti-re-election movement. Francisco I. Madero, member of a well-to-do family with a relevant position in local politics and business in the state of Coahuila in the northern part of Mexico, actively participated in the promotion of an anti-re-election movement. He wrote a book, The Presidential Succession, in 1910, in which he severely criticized the Díaz administration and proposed the creation of an anti-re-election party on which he began to work. He became the presidential candidate of this party. When time arrived, Díaz announced what everybody was expecting, that he would be candidate once more. A few weeks before election day, Madero was charged of committing a crime and arrested, as were other 5,000 of his followers. He was given the city of San Luis Potosí as his prison. While a prisoner, the elections took place, that was in July 1910. The election, as every election during Porfiriato, was the rigged one. Diaz was declared president-elect, and the country, with Diaz at its head, prepared to celebrate in nearby September the centennial of Mexico's independence. Large and impressive diplomatic missions arrived in Mexico from all over the world to be present in those celebrations. There were parades, diplomatic receptions, dedications of museums, new schools, the opening of the National University, and so on. Diaz was at his climax, with full control, with the country in his fist. At least that's what seemed to be. In parallel to all those events, from some years back, something had been boiling beneath the surface. Discontent was much deeper and much more extended than what people in government thought. By the turn of the century, a small group of self-called liberals had been organizing around the country, distributing their publication, Regeneration, demanding the government to stop violating the Constitution, to strictly comply with the reform laws, that's the separation of state and church, the suppression of religious education in private elementary schools, ban of religious practices outside the churches, ban of public officials' presence in religious ceremonies, and calling to restore democracy through peaceful and democratic means, and convoking to organize the Mexican Liberal Party. The head and the most important leader of this movement was Ricardo Flores Magón. The Diaz administration was intolerant with political criticism and opposition. So when the liberals opposed Diaz's re-election in 1903, calling for a democratic transition through elections, they began to be persecuted, many of them jailed or forced to exile, their publications forbidden, finding no space in public in open politics. This situation led them to a radical turn in their position, for they began preparing an armed uprising against the government. By mid-1906, the liberals made public a manifesto and their program, the program of the Mexican Liberal Party, which contained their most important demands and proposals. The first one, to reform the Constitution and suppress the possibility of re-election of the president, vice president, and state governors, which was the core of the Diaz regime. The program also demanded a completely lay education to establish that foreigners, when acquiring real estate in Mexico, lost their nationality, becoming by this sole fact Mexican citizens. A maximum 8-hour working journey, a minimum daily wage of 1 peso, obligation of employers to pay for labor accidents and to provide hygienic housing for their workers, the annulment of peasants' debts with hacendados, to grant land to any solicitor with the sole condition of making it productive, to establish a maximum surface of land the state could grant a solicitor, to protect the Indian race, to establish bonds of union with Latin American nations. Magonistas, that's liberals, also convoked the people to take arms to overthrow the Porfirian government. During his imprisonment, Madero had not been idle. He had kept contact with his followers, making preparations to rebel, and as part of these preparations, drawing a plan. Part of the plan was his escape from his prison city to Texas, and from San Antonio, he launched the plan of San Luis Potosí, that was on October 1910, in which he rejected the outcome of the election, demanded its annulment, called to restore democracy, return the lands of villages and small landholders, mostly Indian, dispossessed by the dictatorship, proclaimed himself provisional president, and convoked the people to take arms against the government, starting precisely on November 20 at 6 p.m. Social unrest, as a consequence mainly of a long drought and very poor crops for several previous years, the aspirations of change provoked by the Diaz-Quilman interview, the penetrating ideas of the Mexican Liberal Party's program, the anti-re-election movement, which had been expanding, and a rigged election, created a favorable climate for the Plan de San Luis, which found fertile soil to ignite revolution in November 1910. Madero's convocation shook the country. Revolution erupted everywhere. New military leaders became to be known: Pascual Orozco, Francisco Villa, Emiliano Zapata. The federal army was incapable of controlling the uprising and suffered a serious defeat, more political than military, when Ciudad Juárez, the most important border city, fell in the hands of the revolutionary commanded by Orozco. Diaz resigned the presidency and went to exile. The peace agreements of Ciudad Juárez were subscribed between the revolutionary and the government. A new presidential election was to be held, but Madero made 3 big political errors by accepting these agreements as were proposed to him. He accepted a provisional government to succeed Diaz, not headed by a revolutionary, but by a recognized Porfirian. The licensing of the revolutionary armies, leaving the federal army intact, and the acceptance as legal of the Congress selected by Diaz, elected in 1910, with which the new government would have to deal. The new election took place. Madero was elected in the fairest election ever held in Mexico, but the revolutionaries were anxious to have their demands met and began revolting even before Madero was elected. Pascual Orozco withdrew recognition of Madero as chief of the revolution. Emiliano Zapata proclaimed the Plan of Ayala, claiming the immediate restoration of lands to the dispossessed villages. Orozco was defeated and went to exile, and Zapata was held, with more or less difficulty, under military control. Porfirians revolted too. Bernardo Reyes and Felix Diaz, Porfirio's nephew, in different moments called to overthrow Madero. They were both defeated and imprisoned. At the same time, Madero had to face opposition in Congress, a fierce criticism from the Porfirian press, now free and unrepressed, and the urge of the revolutionary, who found a very slow and obstructed government incapable of giving response to their demands. On the other hand, the germ of revolt was lived in the federal army, that is, among the Porfirian generals who were in command. After 15 months of a troubled new administration, the coup arrived. The main instigator and conductor was United States Ambassador Henry Lane Wilson, an admirer of Diaz who viscerally disliked Madero. He compromised with the military commanders of the capital, and the coup succeeded. Madero and Vice President Pino Suarez were arrested, forced to formally resign, and held prisoners in the National Palace. A provisional president succeeded them for 45 minutes, in which time he named the military commander of the city Secretary of Government, resigned, and was succeeded by the newly appointed Victoriano Huerta, the usurper as he's known in Mexican history, who ordered the assassination of both the president and the vice president. The revolutionary immediately reacted. The governor of Coahuila, Venustiano Carranza, assuming as first chief of the Constitutionalist Army and in charge of the executive power, declared the recovery of the sovereignty of the state of Coahuila and broken the federal pact, proclaimed the Plan of Guadalupe, calling the people to take arms, denying recognition to the usurper government, and claiming to restore constitutional order. After several months of hard fighting, the Constitutionalists, as Carranza's followers were known, triumphed. But revolutionary victory was unstable. Revolutionary factions, constitutionalism, Villistas, Zapatistas, tried to reach an agreement but failed. Fighting was resumed, revolutionary against revolutionary, constitutionalist on one side, Villa and Zapata on the other. Constitutionalists defeated Villa, who withdrew to Chihuahua. Zapata kept control of large portions of the state of Morelos, where land was restored to the villages. Constitutionalists, save for Villa and Zapata's strongholds, held control of the country and established provisional military state governments, beginning to implement new policies, like land distribution and the recognition of workers' rights, and Carranza convoked a constituent Congress. The Congress met on December 1916 in the city of Querétaro. Carranza submitted a project considered mild, conservative, by the radical wing of constitutionalism. In the background of revolutionary ideology, in every faction, the ideas of the Liberal Party's program are found. We also find Zapata's agrarian demands, which since 1915 had been adopted and shared by constitutionalism. Intense discussion took place in Querétaro. The radicals imposed most of their points of view. It is in the Constitution where the revolution's ideals, commitments, and goals are most clearly exposed. This constitution shows the model of nation the revolution had as its project, shows on which basis the revolutionary expected Mexico's progressive and democratic transformation. Article 39, with a long constitutional history dating from the days of the struggle for independence, proclaims national sovereignty resides essentially and originally in the people, from which every power derives and is instituted in the own people's benefit, the people having at all times the right to alter or modify the form of its government. Article 3 established official education lay and free, forbidding any religious corporation or any religious minister to create or direct elementary schools. Article 27 is the core of the revolution's constitution. In it is the recognition of the nation's rights to impose private property, the characteristics dictated by public interest, to regulate the exploitation of natural resources, of landless villages, to receive land granted by the state. Article 123 recognized workers' rights to a maximum working journey of 8 hours, to sufficient minimum wage, and to strike. Article 130 established the non-recognition of personality to religious organizations denominated churches, forbade religious ministers to criticize the nation's laws or comment on national political events, as well as a prohibition to political organizations to identify through any religious notion. Peasants' demand for land became the most important demand in the revolution. Land distribution and agrarian reform as a more comprehensive process became the core of revolutionary policies. And after the 1917 Constitution's proclamation and the establishment of constitutional governments, the political and social measure of how governments were giving satisfaction to the revolutionary commitment. Carranza, for example, distributed 292,000 acres. The following six administrations, in a period that goes from 1920 to 1934, distributed 16 million acres, mostly of what could be classified as marginal lands. The distribution of this surface did not appease the peasants' demands. During the Cárdenas administration, from 1934 to 1940, land distribution accelerated and affected high-quality land. Land distributed amounted to 39 million acres, more than double of that previously distributed, and was complemented with irrigation policy and the impulse of the peasants' political organization carried under the government's initiative. Since Madero's, the relationship between the government and the foreign-owned oil companies had been, to say the least, rough. In June 1912, Madero's government increased oil export tax by 20 cents per ton, equivalent to 3 cents per barrel, an insignificant increase even in those days. And immediately, Ambassador Lane Wilson sent a harsh diplomatic note protesting against the dismissal of American railway conductors, the supposed pressure the governor was putting in a conflict with British owners of a large hacienda, and the discriminatory and almost confiscatory tax on oil products export. By the end of 1914, constitutionalist forces occupied the port of Tampico. The military commander, Lieutenant Colonel Francisco Mujica, required oil exporters to register at the customs office so they could pay their taxes. Oil companies protested and refused to do so, which made Lieutenant Colonel Mujica order the closure of the pipelines through which oil flowed to be exported. Under this pressure, American companies accepted to pay their taxes at the customs office in Tampico, El Águila, of British ownership, Mexican from a legal point of view, paid under protest. When Carranza's administration decreed in 1917 new taxes on oil exports and on land compromised with oil contracts, the oil companies launched a big wave of protest and demands of justice protection. When a new legislation on drilling concessions in national lands was approved in 1920, protests reached such a dimension, the government suspended the granting of drilling concessions. A few weeks after taking office, President Calles announced a new law would be proposed to regulate oil exploitation. The sole announcement, the bill still under elaboration, made Secretary of State Kellogg protest harshly against the Mexican government for certain agrarian action and for increasing workers' salaries, nothing to do with oil legislation. But at the same time, Ambassador Sheffield attacked the new, still unknown legislation. Situation became so tense by the end of the year 1925, armed intervention was expected. So President Calles ordered the military commander in La Huasteca, one of the main oil-producing areas, to put the wells on fire if an American intervention took place. President Portesillo, who succeeded Calles, wrote in his memoirs, I quote, "General Calles let events serenely go by, and when he had the conviction armed intervention of the United States would be a reality in a few hours, he telegraphed the American president, telling him he was sending, with a person of his absolute confidence, original, very important documents he wished him to know before the crime of invading national territory was committed. And if after reading those documents, the government of the United States still maintained its aggressive attitude against Mexico, he would make them public so the world could judge an unheard of outrage to be committed against a weak nation only defending its sovereignty." Those documents were Secretary of State Kellogg's letters, which had reached President Calles' hands through means up to now in the deepest mystery. On September 22, Ambassador Sheffield left his post. End of the quote. Those letters showed the involvement of Ambassador Sheffield and Secretary of State Kellogg with the oil companies, obtained by a spy infiltrated in the embassy in Mexico, who directly reported to President Calles, known by a code name but never identified. So oil was a matter of conflict between the United States and Mexico since the revolution took power. The most important feat of revolutionary policy is undoubtedly the expropriation of the oil companies and the nationalization of oil industry in 1938. By the end of 1933, the National Revolutionary Party's convention approved the 6-year plan for the term 1934-1940 and proclaimed Lázaro Cárdenas its presidential candidate. The plan stated nationalization of the subsoil would become effective, as well as the state's intervention to balance economic forces in oil industry, stimulating the development of national enterprises. By the end of 1936, oil workers from several unions united to form one union, which on May of the next year demanded from the companies an increase in wages and improvements in working conditions. Demands were rejected by the companies, the workers declared the strike, and the government intervened declaring what in Mexico's labor right is called an economic conflict, that is, leaving the judicial cause follow its course, but allowing the workers not to interrupt working so the oil production could continue. Labor authorities, in several instances, ruled in favor of the workers, the companies rejecting the sentences till the case arrived to the Supreme Court, which confirmed the sentence in favor of the workers. Lázaro Cárdenas kept a diary in which we find his thoughts during the last days of the oil conflict. My personal impression is Cárdenas, before becoming president and even with the oil conflict under course, thought a better control of oil industry was necessary, as well as an increased participation of the state in oil exploitation, but considered unviable the possibility of nationalizing oil industry, which had, as a previous and necessary step, the expropriation of private oil companies, the most important of them of foreign property, and if he ever thought of this possibility, he kept it for himself as an ideal very difficult to make it turn into reality. But the evolution of the labor conflict began to open new perspectives. In his diary on January 1st, 1938, The last sentence of the labor authorities given favorable to the workers a few days before, and the case already in the hands of the Supreme Court for a definitive resolution, Cárdenas wrote, I quote, "National unrest, foreign oil companies, supported by their governments, always rebel to submit to the nation's laws, we shall see. Restore to the nation's full domain the conceded deposits they keep as simple reserves, preventing the country's progress." A large note appeared dated March 9. It says, "On the 7th, by conduct of the United States Embassy, the oil companies' representatives asked to meet with me. They said their companies faced the impossibility to comply with the sentence, consulting if its compliance could be postponed. Answer was given to them, the process had ended and they had to comply with it. At hours 22 the same day, I met with the leadership of the oil union, which informed me they had decided the termination of their working contracts, seeing the company's rebellious attitude, expressing once more their support to the government's decisions. Mexico has today," wrote Cárdenas as a reflection to himself, "the great opportunity of liberating from political and economic pressures exerted over the country by the oil companies exploiting for their benefit one of our major richness. Several revolutionary administrations have tried to intervene in subsoil concessions granted to foreign companies, but circumstances have not been propitious for existing international pressures and internal problems. But today conditions are different. There are no armed confrontations within the country, and a new world war is at the door, and England and the United States frequently talk in favor of democracies and respect to the sovereignty of nations. So it may be the moment to see if the governments that speak so comply with their sayings when Mexico makes use of its sovereign rights." On returning from Zacatepec, that was a new sugar factory, continues that day's annotation of Cárdenas, I called out of the car General Francisco Mujica, Secretary of Communications. I made him know my decision to expropriate the oil companies' assets if they resisted to comply with the Supreme Court's sentence. We talked there wouldn't be such a propitious opportunity as the one present to restore the nation's its oil richness. Not doing so for fear of possible diplomatic demands from England or the United States would be anti-patriotic and with serious responsibilities the people with justice would claim for us. On March 10, Cárdenas wrote, "Up to now, no official mention has been made of the purpose of it to expropriate. When time comes, notice will be given. In political and financial centers, it is generally believed, even by the companies, the government might arrive only to dictate the occupation of industrial installations. Decision on this serious problem cannot wait much longer." On March 18, around 10 p.m., the expropriation of the oil companies was announced. And on the 20th, the nation in turmoil, in the midst of a strong international reaction, Cárdenas with a family and close friends went to picnic. But during all these years we've been talking about, until the present, what happened with elections, designation of candidates and the like. The 1917 Constitution set the foundations of a new institutional life. Problems could be handled and solved according to the rule of law, but when succession times arrived, democratic institutions showed they were still too frail. Vote was not strong enough. Citizens were not politically organized. Factions with sound revolutionary background confronted, and it had to be the force of arms which decided successions in 1920, 24, 28, and 29. Exploring and trying to find a way to consolidate the political system emerged from the revolution, as well as to keep internal peace. A new political party was created, the National Revolutionary Party, a confluence of the then existing regional parties and regional political bosses, where real power became then concentrated and was exercised by the strong hand of who came to be called the maximum chief of the revolution, ex-President Calles, situation that lasted for 6 years after he left the presidency, the period known as the Maximato. Succession during Maximato, even if there were political confrontations between candidates within the PNR, was solved peacefully. That's in 1930 and 34. When a stark confrontation between the president and the maximum chief put an end to Maximato, a year later in 35, last word in political decisions transferred to the president. Going from 1934 to 1982, we find the Mexican political system in transition from a system with a certain grade of flexibility to a completely rigid political system, and from a system committed with the revolution's ideals and goals to a system that not only denied pertaining to revolution's political current, but consciously and consistently taking actions against revolutionary works, legislation, and institutions. In regard to how candidates of the official party were designated, I may say in 1940, 46, and 52, confrontation of candidates within the governing group took place, the president playing the role of an arbiter, and the official resulting candidate running against an opposition candidate with the same common origin. From 58 on, that is till 2000, the candidates of the PRI, the official party, was a personal, intimate, and uncontested decision of the president. By mid-1986, things began to change. A contested movement emerged and expanded within the PRI and more widely within Mexico's dominant political system. This was the democratic current. Its main demands were the government to the government to pay more attention to the people's social conditions, and to the party to abide to its internal rules and select its candidates through democratic procedures. In a short time, the party was to face the selection of its presidential candidate as well as of congressional candidates for the 1988 elections. The democratic current penetrated in the party's ranks and file. The present non-written faculties, that is, his power to decide who would be his successor, began to be publicly contested. The system's apparatus closed ranks around the president. The democratic current was harshly attacked by the system. Every possibility of acting within the party was denied to their members, and when the president exercised his non-formal faculty of designating the party's presidential candidate, the democratic current broke with the PRI and passed to opposition, forming with other political parties and social organizations the National Democratic Front. Democratization from within the system turned to be a lost battle, but it was nevertheless the beginning of a political transition. As many of you may well recall, the 1988 election was a major fraud committed against the people who trusted in the effectiveness and force of their vote and had, as never before, massively and enthusiastically mobilized and participated in the election. Opposition resorted to every legal and political resource, trying to stop the consummation of fraud and make the vote respected. But people were not organized. Culture of citizens' political organization and participation was feeble, not to say inexistent. The National Democratic Front didn't have the capacity to assemble popular force enough through peaceful means to make the government move from its decision. Imposition occurred once more, but the main forces in the Democratic Front made the decision to continue in the struggle to democratize Mexico's political system. The first goal to be reached had to be the gain of full respect for the vote. Turning this goal into reality took some years and important events. Some of them painful and tragic had to happen. Over 600 people assassinated, the assassins remained unpunished, in the organization process of a new political party. A policy of continued frauds in local elections and repression to progressive opposition. The Zapatista uprising in southern Mexico. The assassination of a presidential candidate. A deep economic crisis. At the same time, people becoming more and more conscious their participation in their vote could make Mexico change, and the people putting pressure on the state till political decisions and legal reforms to make electoral authority independent from the executive were made. Reforms of the electoral legislation introduced. Media open to opposition parties and candidates. And finally, in 1997, the midterm federal election in which the vote was respected, the official party losing, for the first time in history, absolute majority in the lower chamber of Congress, and progressive opposition winning the election of mayor of Mexico City, the first time in Mexico's history in which this official was elected by popular vote. From then on, we can consider we have real elections in Mexico, even if our electoral system needs still to be improved. In 2000, elections gave way to alternation. A party different from the one in office would head the executive in the term 2000-2006. In 2006, once more, we had a contested election, not because the votes were wrongly counted or figures altered, but because there had been illegal interventions in support of the two candidates with the higher outcomes. But Mexican democracy and what the Mexican people have been fighting for are not only to assure the vote of every citizen is fully respected. Democracy is that and much more. It is equality, and Mexican society is one of the most unequal in the world. 1% of the richest households concentrate 9% of the gross income, and 1% of the poorest households, 0.07%, that is 130 times less. Democracy is welfare, and poverty affects 66% of total populations, that's 70 million people. It is welfare, and over 40% of labor force lacks social security, and 26 million Mexicans live in informal economy. It means growth, and Mexican economy decreased in 2009, 8%, with an optimistic expectation of growth this year of 1% of the gross domestic product. It means opportunities, and during the past year, over 1 million formal jobs were lost, unemployment reaching over 20 million people. Democracy means opportunities in Mexico, and over 12 million Mexicans have been forced by circumstances to live and work in an irregular migratory situation in the United States. It means access to knowledge, and education and research budgets are being cut. This situation may be partly a consequence of the world crisis, but it's also a consequence of 3 decades of bad policies, and of making a priority of public policies the concentration of wealth in a few, and fixing sight and heart outside our borders. To overcome this situation, we have to bring to our minds which have been the goals Mexicans have been struggling for during this past century, and how has this struggle taken place. The revolutionary fought for democracy, for equality and justice, for education, knowledge, and culture, for a just and generous nation, for shared progress and a fair and equitable world order. To build a new Mexico, the teachings we have from the Mexican Revolution show us the way. Thank you.
We've certainly covered a lot of ground, and so do the questions that we've received. It seems a little unfair after a talk like this to have tough questions, but here they go. What should the top 3 priorities for Mexico leadership to address in 2010?
Mexico, as I said, is a very unequal society, and we have to make it more equal, more egalitarian. And that's a difficult thing to do, but I think that should be one of the aims political parties and society as a whole should have for the next years. I think we should also aim to have a universal social security, We think that is possible. We've been studying that, and we believe that is possible. And I would also think that we could try to propose an addition to NAFTA. So NAFTA could change from a free trade agreement to a development agreement, and not only a trilateral trade agreement with Canada, the United States, and Mexico, but a continental agreement for development, using instruments like those that are being used or have been used in Europe to integrate the European Union, like compensatory funds and other measures that could make this continent with less differences as the ones we have now.
The next question takes us from the Mexican Revolution to today. What is the legacy of Emiliano Zapata today, and in what ways have the ideals which he fought for been realized or thwarted?
Well, Zapata's main struggle was for the land, was to have the peasants granted land, but I would say land seen as the instrument to improve living conditions, to open opportunities for Mexicans. And I would say, in a way, agrarian reform has important achievements. Land has been distributed for maybe, we would be talking about 80 million acres, something like that, 80 to 100 million acres distributed among peasants. But peasants are not in the best living conditions. Agrarian reform is not only the distribution of land, it's land and its technology, its investment, its integration of productive chains, its integration of agricultural production with agro-industry, with export, and that's lacking in Mexico. This second part of the agrarian reform is lacking in many parts of Mexico, and I would say that at this moment there's no commitment from the state to improve living conditions of Mexicans in general, and particularly of Mexican peasants, who in a large proportion have been coming as irregular immigrants here to the United States. So that's still an unattained goal of Zapata's ideals and of the Mexican Revolution's ideals.
The next question concerns the U.S. and Mexico. What would be the best 3 policies to enact to strengthen U.S.-Mexican relations?
Well, one would be one I talked about, to improve or make an addition to NAFTA, transforming this free trade agreement into a development agreement. That would take investments to Mexico, to countries with less developed countries. I think that we would have also to find a different border policy, we could call it. I don't think that steel fences and the increase of the border patrol and repression will solve any problem, not in the States and not in Mexico. I think that's already a failed policy. And I think that other forms, other ways of collaboration should be found between the two countries. If some sectors here of the population consider that migration is a problem, not only Mexican migration, but migration in general, Well, why not trying to find solutions through collaboration, so the people is not forced no more to leave their countries and find opportunities in their own country. So that would be another aspect of collaboration. And I think that we have also to find another form of collaboration to fight drug trafficking, both in Mexico and the United States. And this has to be a shared policy. There are always demands for the Mexican side, but we don't see this kind of intense action against drug trafficking and drug problems here in the United States. So having a shared policy compromised on both sides, I think would be a third issue on which both countries should really change their present policies.
As some of you know, we also ask for questions over the internet. This one is from the internet. What are your views on the progress to date and the future of the reform of the judicial process in Mexico?
Well, I'm not very much, this is not a theme in which I'm very much acquainted, but well, I think we have to really reform our judicial system. We have to, in the first place, to clean it from corruption, both procurement, we say procuración, and administration of justice. Both aspects have to be, corruption has to be eradicated from those two processes in our judicial system. And I think that if we eradicated corruption, we would automatically have a completely different and radically different judicial system in Mexico that would really serve to justice. But first is to eradicate corruption from the judicial system.
The next question is about oil. Is it possible politically to reform the governance of Pemex in the next 10 years?
Well, I don't know what this means exactly, but the governance of Pemex has been changing. I think it's being more or less modernized positively. But if the question pretends to find that privatization of oil could be a better situation, I would say no. I think oil as a strategic resource in Mexico must continue being exploited on the basis that it serves national development and with national aims and not with private aims. So I think that in this case, oil should continue managed and exploited by the state, even if Pemex must improve its working procedures and become a much more efficient, productive enterprise.
The next question is on drugs. Given the current political upheaval, opinion of the current narco policy?
I think that it's an error from the beginning to involve the army to a specialized corps, not the army. And there should be a plan which not only the army and the judicial police or police forces are involved, but in which participation of the media, of the educational systems, of the health systems, of society as a whole should be considered. I think that's the only way, and this has to do also with eradicating corruption from the judicial system, and it has to do with establishing an international policy, and in this case with the United States, so the same policy could be applied in both sides of the border. I think all this should have to be taken into consideration to develop a new policy in drug fighting in Mexico.
This is a political question. What is the future of the left in Mexico?
Well, I would talk not of the left, because left it would be a wide, many organizations that consider to be in the left. But I would say of the PRD, my party. I think that the PRD doesn't put much more attention in organizing, especially where votes have been very low in the last elections. If the PRD has no real proposals that people consider viable in putting into practice, if it doesn't finish with internal confrontation, I would have very, very low expectations for the PRD in the near future. If the left, as a wider movement, has a better proposal, a viable proposal considered as such by the people, and promotes the organization of the people to participate in our political life, well, I could expect better results for the left in the next elections. But I don't see that this is happening in Mexico.
What do you think of proposals for guest workers in the U.S. as part of immigration reform?
As a first step, that could be interesting, I would say. But I think that the solution of the problem is to recognize the contribution of migrant workers, not only Mexicans, to the progress of this nation. In any with their work, the work they're doing, the taxes they're paying, the contribution to culture, the contribution in many aspects to U.S. society, and this has to have the support of the United States society. The change will come if the majority of people here is convinced that this is an important contribution, and a contribution that has to be recognized by the state and by society. And this would mean, I don't know if it's amnesty or any other kind of recognizing the rights of the people that are working here to be recognized as citizens legally working and residing in the United States.
This question's a little more personal. As Mexican students living in the United States, what do you suggest we can do in order to contribute substantially to the empowerment of Mexico, given the high insecurity and economic issues that Mexico is facing today?
So first, to prepare the most soundly possible here to the studies you're conducting here, and well, try to go deep and know what Mexico's conditions are and where the solution to Mexico's problems could be found. I think that's the best contribution that people who study here could make to Mexico. Propose what to do, but trying to go deep in knowledge of how are the situations Mexico's living in economics, in politics, in the social conditions, etc. So I think that what the people studying here could propose would be the best contribution given to Mexico.
This is another question related to immigration issues. This one is from the internet. Why does the Mexican government make it hard for Central and South American immigrants to get to the U.S.?
Because the Mexican government, present in some of the past Mexican governments, are in many aspects at the service of the American government. As simple as that.
Before we take our last question, I want to repeat again that we will have a video up in several days on the website, and Mr. Cárdenas has consented to take further questions that were submitted and answer them on the class website. So before going to our last question, I just wanted to take a moment to thank the staff of the Center for Latin American Studies who put this event together with such care, dedication, and talent. With Dionisio Ramos, our Vice Chair, Secretary, Program Coordinator, our webmaster and design person, Matt Werner, who works on program and technical issues for the center. And I would also like to thank the volunteers who so generously donated of their time and efforts to help us organize this event. Please thank them. I would once again like to thank Mr. Cárdenas for being with us tonight and this evening. One more question that we are going to conclude with. Professor Mons has asked if she could read this last question.
Thank you for allowing me to read this last question. It is a very serious and very challenging question that someone here would like to hear your opinion. ¿Quién va a ganar el mundial? South Africa. It better be Mexico.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, all of you. I would expect Mexico, but